Hey, Tom. Andrea. Tom, by the way, you asked about the live show. It is happening. Details ASAP. But in any case, we'll mention that again at the end. But right now, what I want to talk about in this episode is two different concepts that people tend to conflate a lot. One of those is the labor theory of value. The other is the Marxist theory of labor exploitation under capitalism. And I do get that for a lot of people, it probably sounds like I just said the same thing using, two different phrases. All right? But honestly, in this case, the meme would not be accurate. These really are two different concepts. And what I really want to argue today is that a lot of people are confused in a couple different ways about exactly how those two concepts are related to each other in Marx. Obviously, I don't want to say that Marx was infallible and everyone should just automatically agree with him about any of this stuff. Picking some historical figure who you agree with about a lot of subjects and then just automatically believing everything else they say is a pretty silly way to think, or really a pretty silly way not to think. My own view is that Marx's theory of all this stuff holds up pretty well. There's still some pretty massively important insight there, but hey, we can argue about that. What I really want to push today is that the way that Marx's view works, specifically the way that his theory of value interacts with his theory of capitalist exploitation of labor, is a little bit more complicated and a lot more interesting than a lot of people on various sides of these debates assume that it is. So let's get into this. Sorry, Tony. You've been warned. So a lot of anti-Marxists think that the labor theory of value is something like the Achilles heel of Marxism. The picture that they have in their heads is that first, this is the basic empirical foundation of Marxism. So all the rest of Marx's ideas about capitalism and exploitation and class struggle and the whole thing are built on top of the theory of value. And second, they think that contemporary economics has shown that the labor theory of value is false. So put those two premises together, and you've got the conclusion that Marxism as a whole has been empirically shown to be totally misguided. And if you don't understand that, that's just because you need to capital L, capital E, learn economics. If you capital L, capital E, learn economics, you would therefore learn that the labor theory of value is false because the right view about value is marginalism, which says that the value of commodities is purely a product of consumer preferences. And everything I just said is pretty much the picture that your average, medium sophisticated, bookish kind of libertarian is carrying around in his head. Yeah, Kitty hijacking the stream. He certainly does that. So on the other side, a lot of Marxists accept the first premise, even though they reject the second one. So their view, right, they agree that the Marxist theory of value is super duper foundational for everything else he thinks, or at least they certainly think they need it to make sense of the Marxist account of labor exploitation, but they reject the second premise. So they think it's really important to argue, for example, against marginalism and against other non-Marxist views about value. Now, to throw down my own marker right at the outset here, I think both sides are kind of missing the point about how Marx's theory of value is even supposed to be related to his theory of exploitation in the first place. We'll get there. But first, it's worth taking a minute on reminding ourselves of what the theory of value is even supposed to be. There are huge debates about how to interpret this stuff, but what I'm going to give you is a really simple, really straightforward, literal-minded kind of exposition of what Marx says at the very beginning of his masterpiece, right, Capital. And I'm going to give you that very simple, very literal-minded version for two reasons. First, I don't think we really need to splash around in deep waters in terms of different interpretations of the subtleties of what he says in order to make any of the basic points that I want to make today. Second, I've been through those sections of Capital a bunch of times. I just started my fourth round of teaching a class on Capital Volume 1. And I could be wrong here, but for what it's worth, I really think the simple, boring, obvious interpretation really is the one that Marx probably has in mind. So Marx gives this really straightforward argument in section 1.1 of Capital. He starts by distinguishing between the use value of commodities, in other words, what they can do for the person who possesses them, whether that's a coat's power to keep you warm or its power to impress everybody with what a cool-looking coat you have. So Marx distinguishes that from the exchange value of commodities, which is their specific power of being exchangeable for other commodities, whether you're directly exchanging them or you're using the medium of money. Marx's view on money, developed in section 1.4 and then in chapters 2 and 3, is that money is just a commodity that's been promoted to the status of a universal equivalent, so people accept it in exchange for any other commodity. And he has all this stuff to say about how, ideally it should be something that has, like, the sort of ideal form of money is like pure exchange value, like that's almost its only use value. But the basic point is that it's actually pretty important to him to argue that there's nothing fundamentally special or different going on when we exchange a coat for such and such many dollars or pounds or euros than if we exchange it for such and such many, bags of coffee grounds or yards of linen or whatever, right? And if you read Capital, Marx absolutely loves his yards of linen examples. And Marx's argument in section 1.1 is that exchange value ratios, right? What quantity of one commodity is worth such and such quantity of another commodity only makes sense if there's some property that all the different commodities have in common. So that one coat is worth 10 yards of linen or whatever because one coat has as much of the same underlying property as the 10 yards of linen do. And Marx says that the common property can't be anything about the physical nature of commodities, or their chemical composition or their use values, because all of those things are too heterogeneous. They're too all over the place, right? It's too easy to come up with examples of pairs of commodities that, where the physicality of them is totally different or their use value is totally different or whatever, but we can still say, they have the same exchange value, right? That, one of them is worth one of the other. So you have to look somewhere else. And he very quickly concludes that the somewhere else that you have to look, right, the common property has to be that they're all products of human labor. How much labor time it takes to produce this or that commodity is the single common property that different commodities can have more or less of, but it's all on the same scale. And that's Marx's explanation for how there can be one scale that we use to measure the worth of all the different commodities. Now, this argument moves very quickly, and any reader who's convinced that marginalism is true, right, in other words, that value is all about consumer preferences and nothing else, will probably be driven a little crazy by reading this because of how quick and breezy Marx's argument is in this section. But if you watch David Harvey's Capital lectures on YouTube, or you read his companion to Marx's Capital, which is based on them, I think he makes a pretty compelling point about this, which is one of the reasons Marx moves so quickly in this section, right? That argument, lands so quickly on, well, it must be labor, is that a lot of the bourgeois economists that Marx is arguing against in Capital were, at least in really broad strokes, already on board with something like a labor theory of value. There's something like that idea already in Adam Smith, and there definitely is in David Ricardo. There's a really frustrating footnote in chapter 1 of Capital where Marx says that Ricardo is the bourgeois economist who came closest to being right about value, although he vaguely gestures at some disagreements that he promises he'll unpack in one of the later volumes that he intended to get around to finalizing at some future date. Anyway, the point is just that part of the reason Marx didn't spend much time arguing for the labor theory of value at the outset of Capital is that this is actually common ground between him and a lot of his ideological enemies that he's taking shots at about other topics in Capital. So whatever else they disagreed on, they more or less agreed on this. But now, not so much. Right? Now, your average bourgeois economist absolutely does not accept anything that even remotely looks like this theory of value. Which brings us back to that anti-Marxist story that I started out talking about, the one that says, well, Marxism is based on the labor theory of value, that's point one. And point two, contemporary economics has refuted the labor theory of value, therefore Marxism as a whole is refuted. And if you go around talking about structural exploitation and class struggle and all that, you must be in the grips of an outdated and refuted theory. So for a good example of this, this kind of story, you can take a look at this this article, We're Still Haunted by the Labor Theory of Value, which I'm pulling from the website of a well-funded right-wing think tank called the Foundation for Economic Education. I think I've debated at least two of the FEE people over the years. The author of this particular article, you can see, is one Stephen Horowitz, who, according to his bio at FEE's website, was the distinguished professor of free enterprise in the Department of Economics at Ball State University, where he was also director of the Institute for the Study of Political Economy. He wrote a book called Austrian Economics, an Introduction. So, impressive sounding libertarian economist credentials all around. But what I'm pretty sure Stephen Horowitz never did was read the first section of the first chapter of Capital, which is where Marx lays out his theory of value. So to cash that check a little, right, let's take a look at what Horowitz says. We're just going to look at the first part of the article. He says, why are so many students convinced that they should receive better grades for papers they've spent so much time writing? It is not a belief about the quality of those papers. It is a belief about the hours and hours spent working on them. This fundamental misunderstanding about the value of labor is at the center of the Marxist critique of capitalism. And then he writes, for thousands of years, humans were sure that the earth was at the center of the universe, the sun revolved around it. With the advent of systematic inquiry, scientists had to develop more and more complex explanations for why their observations of the universe did not fit with that hypothesis. When Copernicus and others offered an alternative explanation that was able to explain the observed facts and did so more clearly and concisely, the heliocentric model triumphed. The Copernican revolution changed science forever. There's a similar story in economics. For hundreds of years, many economists believed that the value of a good depended on the cost of producing it. In particular, many subscribed to the labor theory of value, which argued that a good's value derived from the amount of work that went into making it. Much like the geocentric view of the universe, the labor theory of value has some superficial plausibility, as it does seem that goods that involve more labor have more value. However, much like the story in astronomy, this theory got increasingly complicated as it tried to explain away some obvious objections. Starting in the 1870s, economics had its own version of the Copernican revolution as the subjective theory of value became the preferred explanation for the value of goods and services. Today, the labor theory of value has only a minuscule number of adherents among professional economists, but it remains all too common in other academic disciplines where they discuss economic issues, as well as among the general public. The labor theory of grades is, as I noted above, particularly popular among college students. Chortle. But again, there's no way Horowitz actually got all the way to the end of the first section of the first chapter of Capital. Because if he had, he would, what he would have got into, right, that he pretty clearly did not, is that what Marx says about value, right, is that when he says, okay, so it has to be the value of a commodity has to be about the labor time it takes to produce it, he specifically says the average socially necessary labor that it takes to produce it. And by the way, if if you're coming into this and you really know your Capital Volume 1, Chapter 1, you'll know what he actually says is it's the abstract average socially necessary labor. We'll get to the abstract, I promise. But for now, right, let's just talk about the average and socially necessary parts. Marx explicitly says that it would be ridiculous to say that one commodity is more valuable than another because the first one was made by a lazier worker, or one who moved more slowly, maybe had an injury or something, or who's just bad at his job, or because it was made at a factory that didn't have tools as advanced as most other factories in your society, or whatever, right? All of this chortling from Horowitz about students who think they deserve higher grades because they work more slowly is just totally beside the point, as an analogy for the theory of value that's endorsed in section 1.1 of Capital. The value of a commodity, according to Marx, is the average amount of socially necessary labor time it takes to produce it. In other words, the average given the prevailing level of industrial technology, the prevailing work techniques, and how much of the product consumers actually want. Marx explicitly goes out of his way to say that if you're not engaged in socially necessary, Marx explicitly goes out of his way to say that you aren't engaged in socially necessary labor if you're producing things that no one wants to buy. So like a couple weeks ago, I saw that, Econ Twitter was dogpiling Matt Brunig for saying obviously true things. That, happens every once in a while. And during this particular dogpile, I happened to notice someone accused Matt of believing in a mudpie labor theory of value, which again is a way of sneering at Marx's theory of value that proves that you never even bothered to read the first few pages of Capital. The idea is, these silly labor theory of value people believe that something is valuable just because you spend a lot of time working on it. And, even if you spend like all day laboring to make mud pies that no one wants. But again, that's just explicitly contradicts the average socially necessary parts. So a lot of times when I've done these Capital classes, the way that I feel about this is a little bit analogous to how I feel when I'm teaching like regular college classes. Like say I'm teaching an intro ethics class and the students there are learning about utilitarianism. I'm not a utilitarian. If you look it up, I've written very critical things about utilitarianism. But if my students are reading John Stuart Mill or whatever, I actually try pretty hard to get them to take utilitarianism seriously, not to caricature it, and to realize it's a lot harder to knock down than they might think. Because whatever I thought about utilitarianism, that would be the sort of basic obligation of somebody trying to teach this. And it's kind of the same deal here. Like whatever conclusion you end up coming to about the theory of value, whether you ultimately accept it or whether you ultimately reject it, I want you to at least understand it, to not caricature it, and to realize it's a lot harder to knock down than you might think. So the Horowitz or mudpie kinds of critiques of it are really dumb. But at the same time, there are serious objections that can be made to it. For example, there's a passage in Chapter 1 of Capital that if you watch those David Harvey lectures, he has kind of a record scratch reaction to, where Marx considers the issue of skilled labor. Like, to use an anachronistic illustration, think about the difference between an hour of the labor of an engineer at Apple designing, their latest shiny gadget for us to scroll on all day, and an hour of the labor of one of the hyper-exploited assembly line workers at the Foxconn plants, where they're actually slapping together the shiny gadgets, right? The factories where they've got the suicide nets outside the windows. Should we say that in calculating the value of the final product, those 2 hours of labor contribute exactly as much as each other? You could just bite the bullet and say yes, but Marx himself isn't comfortable doing that. And there's this famous passage where Marx says that an hour of skilled labor amounts to like a concentrated form of multiple hours of unskilled labor, right? That it's a complex that can be reduced to this simpler labor. But he never quite says what, how that reduction works. And it's been a head scratcher ever since for a certain kind of Marxist economist. This is called the skilled labor reduction problem. Even Marx's lifetime best friend and close collaborator, Engels, who we talk to about this stuff all the time, didn't know the answer. And that's not me speculating. We know for sure that Engels didn't know the answer, because if you read his book, The Anti-During, which Engels put out 10 years after Capital, Engels says explicitly in the book that it's a problem that at this stage of at this stage of value theory hadn't been solved yet. So that's one small example of a technical problem for Marx's theory of value. There are others. You can also, of course, just sort of make arguments that even if this is a coherent framework for thinking about value, some other framework like marginalism might just be simpler or more explanatory or whatever, right? Again, we don't need to get into all of that for today. I think just giving this one illustration of a possible technical problem should be good enough for our purposes today, because this isn't really an episode about the debate about whether the labor theory of value is true or false. Instead, my big claim here is just that a lot of people on both sides have really misunderstood that relationship between the labor theory of value on the one hand and Marx's theory of capitalist exploitation on the other hand, right? That they think this is the same thing, but it's not. I promise I will get to that in just a minute. First, though, 2 quick points of clarification before I move off the theory of value itself, and try to connect, like, okay, what's the actual relationship to that theory and Marx's views about exploitation? First, I said earlier that Marx doesn't technically say that the value of a commodity is the average socially necessary labor time it takes to produce it. He says it's the average socially necessary, wrong one. He says it's the average socially necessary amount of abstract labor that it takes to produce it. Now, that distinction, at least as I would read it, and again, I'm just giving you the boringly straightforward, literal-minded presentation of the actual words that Marx writes in Capital, not getting into the esoteric debates between different sort of super sophisticated readings of it. But the distinction that Marx is making is between concrete and abstract labor. Concrete labor means a particular specific kind of labor process, like weaving versus spinning versus working on an oil rig versus, putting together those shiny gadgets at the Foxconn factory versus podcasting, versus, being a barista versus whatever, right? So those are all different concrete labor processes. Abstract labor is what all of these have in common. In other words, what we get when we conceptually abstract away from what makes each labor process unique to see what they all have in common, which is, Marx tells us over and over again in chapter 1, that these are all ways of exercising the basic human capacity to work, our brains and muscles and nerves. Some people just hair off on these weird interpretive rabbit holes where they convince themselves that abstract labor means like labor that's been standardized by market pressures that are specific to capitalism and is regulated with time clocks and all that, rather than like working in your own way, without being ruled by, by time or standardization pressures. And people who read it that way, that gets linked to these elaborate stories where capitalism, is the rule of something called value. And what they mean by value is something like market pressures to produce things in standardized ways governed by exact time measurements, or some such thing, which honestly, sometimes I think that those sorts of stories, people like Moshe Pistone, for example, kind of amount to a way of stealthily substituting this kind of hippie-ish critique of modern industrial civilization being inauthentic or whatever for Marx's analysis of capitalism as a class structure, which really does not have much of anything to do with that. At least that's what I think. But my view, for what it's worth, is just that abstract labor means the general thing that all these concrete labor processes have in common. Anyway, the second point here is about the relationship between value and price. Something a lot of people learn when they're first starting to learn about capital, and this much is true, is that labor theory of value does not mean labor theory of price. Again, that much is definitely true. Marx is very, very clear, even in chapter 1, where he talks about gold, that value and price can come apart. In other words, that it's not true that everything is always sold at its value. And if you read all the way up through volume 3, you'll get to Marx worrying a lot about something called the transformation problem, which is basically all about how value and price can actually come really far apart. But again, people who use the word value to mean like market pressures for standardization and exact time measurement or whatever often overstate the point about the theory of value not being a theory of price. Because of course, if you read Capital, not just chapter 1, but the other 32 chapters of the book, Marx absolutely does have a theory of price that has to do with value. He'll talk about something called the law of value, which is a prediction that over time, given enough market activity, prices will be driven into at least the general vicinity of values. He thinks supply and demand pressures can kind of push and pull at prices, but in the long run, all else being equal, the value of a commodity will at least tend to orbit around the general vicinity of its labor time value, right? The price of the commodity will orbit around at least that general vicinity. And there's a lot you can say about this. And, there are sophisticated contemporary defenders of something like this, people like Anwar Sheikh, right? I'm not taking any position on any of that one way or the other. But all that really matters for our purposes today is just the simple and straightforward point that sometimes goods are sold at their value and sometimes they're not. Okay, but what does all this have to do with where we started? About exploitation and that sort of anti-Marxist argument that Marxism and the Marxist theory of exploitation rely on the labor theory of value, and the labor theory of value has been refuted by contemporary economics, therefore Marxism has been refuted. Well, I think there are a couple things worth noticing here right away. The first is that I haven't said a word yet about the existence of classes of capitalists and workers, which is a pretty good indication that we haven't actually gotten to Marxist theory of capitalist exploitation yet. Another good indication of that is that even if we could argue about exactly how much overlap there is, there's clearly some overlap between Marx's take on value and the views of those bourgeois economists like Smith and Ricardo, who did not believe that capitalism was a system of exploitation the way that like feudalism was. They celebrated capitalism as a realm of market freedom. So to the extent that what you've got in the opening sections of Capital is Marx agreeing with those guys about value. And that's certainly the way he presents it. He's filling up those early sections with footnotes where he cites their books in ways that mostly seem approving on these basic points about value. It sounds like we haven't gotten to the disagreement yet. Third, and this really gets to at least start to cash the check we wrote at the beginning of the episode, I think if this is your first time hearing in any depth about what Marx says about value and capital, and I know we haven't gone that deep, but if you haven't gone even as deep as this yet, you might notice that there's an interesting disconnect between what a lot of people hear when they hear the phrase labor theory of value and what we actually mean if we're using that phrase to describe Marx's theory of value in the first 3 chapters of Capital. The patron saint of this show, the late Canadian analytic Marxist thinker G.A. Cohen, has a really interesting paper about all of this called The Labor Theory of Value and the Concept of Exploitation. I don't agree with 100% of everything Cohen says in there, but it's really worth reading. He makes a lot of really interesting points, and definitely with him on more than 50%. But anyway, one of the basic points that Cohen makes in this paper is about that disconnect between what a lot of people will hear when they hear the phrase labor theory of value and what we mean when we're using it to describe Marx's view about value in Volume 1, Chapter 1 of Capital. A lot of grassroots socialists, the kind of people who watch and listen to shows like this one, in other words, a lot of those people don't just think the labor theory of value is true. They think it's obviously true. Like, they don't understand how anyone can deny it unless they've, drank deeply of the Kool-Aid of capitalist propaganda, and maybe not even then. But what I just laid out, which again is the boringly straightforward rendition of what Marx says about value and capital, which, actually isn't much. He doesn't say that much about it. To hear some people talk about this, you'd think Capital was a book about value theory, when actually his comments on what value is make up, a tiny handful of pages at the beginning of a 1,000-page doorstopper. But what Marx does say, which is that the value of a commodity is the average socially necessary labor time it takes to produce it, once we abstract away from the specifics of different labor processes and maybe do some kind of weird accounting for skilled versus unskilled labor, and that sometimes commodities are sold at their value and sometimes they drift away from their value, but over time prices tend to be driven into at least the general orbit of value. That set of claims might or might not be true, but it's certainly not obviously true, right? It's a complicated technical claim, and if you want to figure out whether it's true, you have to get into a complicated technical argument. So why is it that so many grassroots socialists think that the labor theory of value is not only true, but obviously true? And I think the answer here, and this is somewhat along the lines of what Cohen says, but this is me, this isn't exactly how he puts it, is that when a lot of grassroots socialists hear the phrase labor theory of value, what they're really hearing is like a labor theory of stuff that has value, or maybe a labor theory of profits. Like, I can remember a time when, as a bright-eyed and bushy-tailed young socialist, I thought that it was obvious that the labor theory of value is true. And I think back then, if you'd asked me to explain why it was obvious, I would have said something like, well, think about like General Motors. I'm from mid-Michigan, it's an obvious go-to. All the revenue that General Motors has comes from the labor of people making cars and selling cars. So the whole pie that's being divided up between profits and wages comes from those activities. So definitionally, everything that executives and shareholders get comes from labor. And look, if that's what you mean by the labor theory of value, then yeah, not only is that true, it's very obviously true. And by the way, a lot of the anti-Marxist argument relies on this same conflation, because people will say, oh, the labor theory of value isn't true, contemporary economics has proved that, and what they'll mean is, by the labor theory of value, is the sort of technical claim from Chapter 1 of Capital, but then they'll say, they'll treat that as if it were a refutation of the kind of claim I just made about General Motors, that sort of labor theory of profit. But of course, that's just a non sequitur, right? Like, even if you don't think that the technical claim about value is true, that doesn't mean that the sort of labor theory of stuff that has value or labor theory of profits is false. That doesn't follow. And look, the sort of labor theory of stuff that has value, or like the labor theory of where profits come from, is obviously true. Now, that obviously true thing doesn't get you quite all the way to Marx's theory of exploitation. We'll get to that. But it gets you far enough in that direction that it's easy to see that if that's what you think the labor theory of value means, it's a lot easier to understand how people get the idea that I've been representing with this goofy little meme, which, if you're listening to this later in the podcast form, it's the corporate wants to, to tell me the difference between these two pictures, and one of them is the labor theory of value, and the other is the Marxist account of labor exploitation, right? So it's sort of, again, if that's what you have in mind, that's what you hear when you hear the phrase labor theory of value, then it's easy to see how you could get the idea that those are really the same picture. but they're really not. In fact, not only is Marx's theory of value not in itself his theory of capitalist exploitation, but Marx is super duper explicit in the opening chapter of Capital, the chapter where he's laying out the theory of value, that he's not even talking about capitalism yet. Now, weirdly enough, some people will insist all day, every day, that Marx is talking about capitalism in that opening chapter. So, for example, if you read this book, the Soren Mau's Mute Compulsion, Marxist theory of the economic power of capital, then he makes a big deal of saying capital is about capitalism from the very first page. And Michael Heinrich in this book, How to Read Michael Marx's Capital, makes a big thing of saying how we know that Marx is already talking about the specific structures of capitalism in chapter 1, because the opening sentence of chapter 1 is the wealth of all societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails takes the form of an immense collection of commodities. But I'm sorry, that's just not what that sentence means. Right? If you say the wealth of all societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails takes the form of an immense collection of commodities, that doesn't mean that, Marx's analysis of commodities and value is only supposed to apply under capitalism. That's a weird logical leap from the actual content of that sentence. And I think that to get a better handle on this, it's useful to go back to the preface to the first edition, where Marx says a couple of really interesting things. Yeah, the cat has been fed. One is that Marx says that people have been trying to get to the bottom of what value is for thousands of years, which sure makes it sound like he's saying there has been a thing to get to the bottom of for thousands of years. And certainly market exchange, commodities being produced and sold, is a phenomenon that's existed for thousands of years. They had all that in Aristotle's Athens, for example. But pretty clearly, capitalism is a much more recent historical development than that. And second, Marx says in that preface that the reason that people have tried to get to the bottom of value for so long without making much progress until recently, even if they've discovered lots of interesting things about more complicated economic phenomena, is that commodities are the economic cell form of market societies. And by analogy, it's easier to understand animals that are made out of complex combinations of cells that are visible to the naked eye than it is to understand the cells they're made out of. Aristotle, for example, made lots of, filled up, books of empirical observations about plants and animals, but he didn't know about biological cells because it would take thousands of years for microscopes to be invented. And of course, that's where the analogy breaks down. Marx notes that sadly we don't have microscopes for study of political economy. We have to use abstract arguments and theoretical models, but that's enough to get us started in an interesting direction, because the same cell form can make up entirely different kinds of animals depending on how those cells are put together. So why does Marx start by talking about commodities and value before he gets to anything specifically capitalist? So here's the goofy little analogy I always use for that in my capital classes. Imagine that at some point in the future, humans make contact with some strange and monstrous kind of, silicon-based alien life form. Maybe the silicon aliens keep melting the faces off our astronauts or something. Eventually, we manage to get the body of one of the monsters back to Earth and do a detailed autopsy. And then some future exobiologist writes up a manual on the aliens. The first sentence of the first chapter, right, might very well be the first thing you need to know about the monsters, that they're made out of silicon, right? The exobiologist might well devote the whole first chapter of the manual to talking about the general properties of silicon before he even gets to the specific biology of the aliens. That would make sense because whatever else was true of the monsters, the first and most striking thing to notice is that unlike every other life form we've ever encountered before, which were all made out of carbon, these ones are made out of silicon, right? And so, yeah, you need to understand something about silicon in general if you're going to understand the aliens. And my claim is that capital starts by saying, hey, the first thing to notice about capitalist wealth before we even get to the process of labor exploitation that generates it is that it's made out of commodities, and then providing a general theory about the value of commodities. Because capitalism is very far from being the first class system in human history, the first system of labor abstraction that's ever existed. You know, we've had lots before. Remember the opening of the Communist Manifesto, all hitherto existing history is the history of class struggle. But one thing that makes capitalism really strikingly different from all the class systems that have come before it is that it's made out of market interactions in ways that none of the others were. Marx is going to claim that under capitalism, just like under feudalism, under ancient slave systems, and so on, there's a class of dominated producers whose surplus is being extracted. But under those previous systems, that extraction wasn't mediated through market exchanges between the producers and their exploiters. So that's interesting and different. But Marx really goes out of his way to make it clear that the opening chapters aren't intended as a theory of capitalism yet, just a general theory of commodities and their value and how that value can take the form of money. For one thing, in chapter 1, look this up. It might be different in the Princeton since they're translated a different German edition, but if you have the Penguin edition, this is chapter 1, footnote 15. Marx explicitly says that at this stage of the presentation, wage labor does not exist. And then, like, if you read that Soren Mao book, which I should say is worth reading, you know, there's good stuff in there. They're interesting insights. But I just think he's totally wrong about this and a few other things. But after Mao's confident insistence that capital is about capitalism from the very first page, he has to do this weird, awkward thing where he says that, well, it's about capitalism from the very first page, but in the first part, he's abstracting away from wage labor and the existence of a separate class of capitalists. And okay, I'm sorry, but that's like saying that a claim about shapes is only supposed to apply to triangles, but we're abstracting away from little details about triangles, like the fact that they have 3 sides. That doesn't really work. And second, Marx is very explicit that the kind of commodity circulation he has in mind in these early chapters is CMC, right? So that's commodities being exchanged for money in order to exchange the money for other commodities. So the point of the exercise is to exchange use values you don't need, you know, or you don't need as much, in order to get other use values that you need more, right? He calls CMC the circuit of simple commodity circulation, as opposed to the more interesting thing that's going on under capitalism. And he says over and over again that this circuit of simple commodity circulation is the characteristic form of most commodity exchange in pre or non-capitalist societies. And by the way, when he's explaining how this works, that's the occasion of one of my all-time favorite illustrations. There are examples right in the whole book where he gives the example of a linen weaver who sells his linen to buy a Bible. Marx calls the linen weaver a man of the old school. And I think that since the first time I read that passage, this guy has become like a fully fledged character in my head. I think about the man of the old school and imagine that guy judging me for my various life choices. And in context, Marx is making a point about the role of money, which I said earlier, that for Marx, money is a commodity that's been promoted to the universal equivalent position, meaning people accept it in exchange for any other commodity. And there are interesting questions about how to think about this in relationship to contemporary, like, fiat currency. I've got thoughts, but let's not go down that rabbit hole. The second, it's going to take us too far away from where we want to go. Take my capital classes if you want to hear about that. Anyway, the point is that having a commodity in this special universal equivalent position greases the wheels of exchange of all the other commodities. And Marx illustrates that with the example of the man of the old school, right, the linen weaver, who sells his linen to buy a Bible, and what Marx calls the Bible pusher, who doesn't want linen, but does want money in exchange for his Bible that he can then turn around and use to buy booze. Because, and this is one of my favorite turns of phrase in Capital, the Bible pusher prefers a warming drink to cool sheets. And by the way, I've always wondered if this is if this passage in Capital might be part of the inspiration for the Peter Bogdanovich movie Paper Moon, which it's from the 70s, but it's black and white. It looks like it was made much longer ago than that. If you've never seen this, I'd really recommend it. It's a great movie, and it's in fact, right, one of the two main characters is indeed a Bible salesman who tends to use the money for the Bibles that he sells to buy booze. And I think the novel that Paper Moon is based on, I think I looked this up once, and the author of the novel, I believe, spent some time as a journalist in the Soviet Union, so it's not impossible that at some point, he ran into somebody teaching a class on Capital, and he encountered the Bible, Bibles for booze illustration there. But in any case, but when Marx starts to talk about capitalism explicitly, right? Yeah, that's right. Tom is the best supporting actress for Oscar for 10-year-old Tatum O'Neal. Yeah, great movie. Love Bogdanovich, particularly love Paper Moon. But in any case, when Marx finally starts to talk about capitalism, which happens in part 2 of Capital, the title of part 2 is from money to capital, right? He's very explicitly saying, okay, now we're switching subjects. We're going to talk about capitalism per se. The first thing he says about capitalism, right, the capitalist mode of production, right? He never actually used the word capitalism, but he says the capitalist mode of production. It's what we mean by capitalism. First thing he says about it is that, okay, well, if you think about what the capitalist is doing, right, the sort of defining economic activity of the capitalist mode of production, the first thing that you'll notice about it is that unlike the kind of simple commodity circulation we were talking about before, which is in fact what the worker is doing under capitalism, right? It's selling their labor power for wages that they can then use to buy rent and groceries. That's a form of CMC. It's what lots of sort of self-employed small proprietors are doing under capitalism, right? The guy with the halal food stand or whatever, right? He's selling the food and in order to get money to buy particular use values they need, whatever, right? But what the capitalist is doing under capitalism, the sort of main economic activity that's driving forward capitalism, and the halal food seller, sort of, it's more complicated, but anyway, put that aside for now. I shouldn't have brought it up. What the capitalist is doing under capitalism, the thing that's driving the whole system forward, that gives it its momentum, is he's engaged in a different process, right? The process that he's engaged with is MCM, right? Investing money in commodities in order to make more money. And really, of course, what he's doing is MCM prime, right? The money to commodities to more money, right? Prime is extra money. And throughout part 2, Marx kind of teases you with this question of where does the extra money come from? And of course, it could come from all sorts of places in individual cases. Again, if you're talking about the halal food seller who's not exploiting anybody, right? I mean, to the extent that that they are doing a little bit of accumulation, right? It's just from the sweat of their own brow, right? But certainly we can talk about merchant capitalists who might just be very good at buying low and selling high. We can talk about big politically connected capitalists who might use their political connections to get exclusive contracts for things and thus allow them to sell them back for more than they're worth, etc. But he's particularly interested, and this is the point I really want to get to today, he's particularly interested in how it's possible that MCM prime could be going on. In other words, the sort of process of capitalist economic activity, right? You're investing capital, you're investing money in, commodity, capital commodities, and you're then, somehow or another at the end of the process, you've got more money back. How is it possible that that's happening without violating what Marx calls the law of exchange? Right? So the law of exchange is just the idea that value is being traded for equal value, right? That the value of one commodity is being exchanged for, another commodity or, whatever money of the same value, right? Nobody's being cheated, right? Nobody's getting ripped off in the process of market exchange. And Marx is willing to accept, look, let's just assume for the sake of argument the law of exchange is being scrupulously followed here. Obviously, he knows that in real capitalist economies, in lots of ways, it actually isn't. But he says, look, let's just assume, let's work on the assumption. Let's pretend that in 100% of cases, the law of exchange is being followed, right? 100% of commodities are being sold at their value. If everything is being sold at its value, where could this extra M, right, between the beginning and the end of the MCM prime circuit possibly come from? Where's the delta M, which if you read these chapters, if you're the one I just capital class just started on Patreon, it's going to be a few weeks before we get to this because we're taking it so slow. But delta M is just the Marx's expression for the difference between M and M prime, right? Where's the delta M come from? Where does the extra money come from between the beginning and the end of the process? If we assume that that everybody is following the law of exchange. And it looks like a big mystery. And Marx, Marx even says, look, let's just drop the assumption that everybody's following the law of exchange. Just for a minute, he takes it back up after that. But even if we assume that the law of exchange is being violated, then there's still a big question about where the delta M comes from, where the extra M between M and M prime in that circuit comes from. Right? Where could the capitalist profits possibly be originated? You could say, he says, right, this is sort of in chapter 5, this is one of the most striking, observations. You could say, okay, look, some people are better at business than others. That's more or less the capitalist zone theory of where its profits come from, right? Because it's so self-flattering, right? Like, oh, it comes from my skills as a savvy businessman. And Marx doesn't deny that. He doesn't deny that, of course, some people are better at business than other people. Of course, that's true. Right? But he says this can't really explain what we're interested in when we're trying to study political economy of capitalism, because sure, if one person is a better and savvier businessman than another person, and the first person manages to buy low and sell high and all that stuff, that could explain where the delta M comes from for one particular capitalist, right? That explains why one capitalist becomes richer than another capitalist who gets the better of in business deals does. But that can't explain where the wealth of the capitalist class as a whole comes from, right? So if we're thinking not about an individual capitalist going from M to M prime, right? But we're thinking about the entire capitalist class, right? Going from M to M prime and to M prime prime or whatever as they build up their collective capital, then this business savvy thing doesn't really explain anything anymore, right? Marx says, again, one of the most memorable lines of chapter 5, that the capitalist class of the entire society can't collectively defraud itself, right? So there has to be some other place where it comes from. And Marx has a very specific theory of where it comes from, which is that one of the commodities, right, the most important commodity that the capitalist is buying during the M to C part of the M to C to M prime process is labor power, right? So what Marx thinks workers are selling in capitalist labor markets isn't their labor per se, it's their labor power, their general capacity to work over given periods of time. And Marx says that labor power is a special commodity because it has the special magical property of producing more value than it itself is worth. So how does that work? Well, remember, the value of any commodity is the average amount of, socially necessary abstract labor that it takes to produce it, right? So therefore, the value of labor power must be the average socially necessary labor time in the abstract that it takes to produce it. Okay, well, how much labor time does it take to produce labor power? I mean, like, are we talking about, producing human beings, in the birds and the bees sense? What are we talking about here? And so Marx says, well, the value of labor power is, what it takes to produce the labor from one day to the next, right? What it takes to reproduce their labor power from one day to the next. In other words, to keep that human being going with the capacity to show up to work the next day and, and at some reasonable standard of subsistence. And Marx says what counts as a reasonable standard of subsistence isn't transhistorical, right? It's not the same for all times and places. That, like, I mean, you think about it, a certain kind of capitalist apologist loves to say, oh, well, what counts as a poor person in the US would be the wealthiest man and, whatever, some medieval French village or something. It's like, yeah, okay. But that really misses the point, right? If somebody is, even if somebody is like a super duper hardcore supporter of capitalism, they've got a, copy of Atlas Shrugged that, the pages are falling out because they've read it so many times. And that person is born into a poor neighborhood in the US and they dream of climbing out of poverty. And of course, as a good Randian, they believe that with the force of their talent, they will be able to climb out of poverty and, and leave everybody else in the dust. You couldn't tell that person, oh, you're actually already not in poverty because, you wouldn't count as being poor in a medieval French village. They wouldn't say, oh, never mind. Okay, I have nothing to climb out of anymore. I'm actually good. I've achieved it, right? They wouldn't say that. Nobody would say that, right? I think Marx very correctly recognizes that there's no such thing as a transhistorical standard of poverty that applies both to the 21st century United States and a medieval French village than there is a transhistorical standard of speaking correct English that applies both to the era of Chaucer and the era of Shakespeare and the era of Philip Roth, right? That it's a historically contingent concept. Marx says there's a historical and moral element to it. In other words, it depends to a certain extent on the level of technological progress that's been achieved, the results of class struggle, all that stuff. But whatever counts for a particular society in a particular era of history as a reasonable standard of subsistence, the value of labor is however much labor time, socially necessary, average, and blah, 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 labor time it takes to produce somebody's labor power from one day to the next at that reasonable standard of subsistence. Well, how much is that? Well, it's whatever it takes to produce the package of commodities that the worker needs to buy in order to keep himself at that level of subsistence. Right? So the value of labor power is whatever the value is of the package of commodities that the laborer needs in order to reproduce himself at a current level of subsistence. Okay, now we're getting somewhere, and I think the real key to understanding this has to do with the two-front war that Marx is waging ideologically in Capital. So one front of the ideological war, the one that might be a little bit more obvious on a sort of first reading, is that Marx wants to fight with the bourgeois apologists who think that capitalism is not a class system the way that feudalism was. It's not a system based on exploitation and domination, because it can't be, because it's made out of free market exchanges. And so that we're all free and equal people in market interactions, so how could a system built out of that possibly be a system of domination and exploitation, a system of classes like feudalism? So that's one front of the two-front ideological war. The other front is that Marx is criticizing people he sees as bad critics of capitalism, like Proudhon, who gets a couple of snarky footnotes in the early chapters of Capital. And so those bad critics of capitalism are ones who think that capitalism is, in some sense, a system of exploitation, right? There is some sense in which workers are being exploited, but their analysis of what that sense is in which workers are being exploited is that workers are being exploited because they're not getting the full value of their labor, that they're being exploited in the sense that they're being like ripped off in unequal exchanges, right? So the bad critics of capitalism say capitalism is exploitative insofar as the law of exchange is being violated, that maybe there is something special about money that, because workers are being paid in money rather than like labor time notes, that means that like that pulls the wool over their eyes, that like tricks them into accepting unequal exchanges, or maybe it has something to do with the fact that these exchanges go on in ways that are distorted by the power of the state for people who are more like anarchisty critics of capitalism, that often understood the power of the state as this kind of holdover from feudalism that distorted markets, right? So on the first front, the apologists for capitalism would say there's no exploitation and domination to see here. There can't be, because capitalism is a system of free market exchanges. People are trading value for equal value. Nobody's being ripped off. On the other front, he's saying the bad critics of capitalism are saying capitalism is a system of exploitation in the sense that the law of exchange is not being followed. People are not trading value for value because workers are not getting the full value of their labor. And oftentimes there are, I think, people who assume that the first few chapters are Marx's theory of exploitation sort of think that he must be doing a version of the second criticism of capitalism, that he must be saying that, oh, well, since the value of commodities, is the labor time it takes to produce them, that, we can sort of extract from that there's a kind of unequal exchange going on here. But Marx is really at great pains to say, no, both of these are wrong. Capitalism is a system of exploitation, so the first people are wrong, but it's not a system of exploitation in the way that the second group thinks that it is. So to see, in fact, Marx wants to show it's not that, well, if markets weren't being distorted by money trickery or the power of the state or whatever, then everything would be fine. But actually, no. Like, just the basic dynamics of market exchange in combination with a set of property relations that gives you a propertyless workforce that's desperate enough to sell itself to the capitalists, those two facts in combination are enough to get you exploitation, even if we assume, for the sake of argument, that the law of exchange is being scrupulously followed all around, right? So, for example, if you read this thing, which is, sorry, let me just all right, just pulling this up so I can look at it here. So what we've got on the screen right now, if you can see that, is Marx's notes on Adolf Wagner's Lehrbuch der politischen Ökonomie so this is about 12 years after Capital. But the significant thing about this is that there's a point in here, right, where so Marx goes on. He says, I demonstrate in detail that even if only equivalents were exchanged in the exchange of commodities, the capitalist, as soon as he pays the worker the real value of his labor power, would have every right, i.e. such right as corresponds to this code of production, to surplus value. And I know that if you're kind of new to this, you're hearing a lot of this for the first time. What I just read off maybe doesn't mean a lot to you, but let me see if I can unpack what I take to be Marx's thought here. That Marx wants to show that there is such a thing as structural exploitation of labor that's built into the fabric of capitalism. And it's not a question of, the sort of norms of market fairness being violated, the law of exchange being violated. In fact, he wants to show that capitalism would be a system of exploitation and domination, even if the law of exchange was being scrupulously followed in 100% of circumstances. Well, how could that possibly be? All right. Those of you who are in the Patreon Capital class are getting a preview of stuff we're not going to get to for many weeks. So how could it possibly be? Well, there are a couple of points here. But the most important one is that given that you have a distribution of property, right, as a set of property relations that gets you this propertyless workforce, right, this assetless class of people who have no choice but to enter into capitalist labor markets, right? Then this labor force is what Marx calls doubly free, right? Doubly free means, on the one hand, it's free from, it's free in the way that like feudal serfs, for example, were not. That proletarians are free to move around and make, employment contracts with any capitalist who will have them. On the other hand, they're free from any other means of supporting themselves beyond entering into labor contracts with capitalists. And so Marx thinks that the effect of this is that workers under capitalism are similar to serfs under feudalism. They're similar to slaves and ancient slave modes of production, in the sense that part of what they're spending their day doing is what he calls necessary labor, and part of it is what he calls surplus labor. In other words, in all three of these systems, right, slavery, feudalism, and capitalism, the whatever the class is of immediate producers spends part of the day producing to meet their own needs, and part of it producing to enrich the ruling class, the class that controls the means of production in whichever system. And it says that this relation is disguised in opposite ways under slavery and capitalism, but it's right there out in the open under feudalism. So in slave systems, the superficial appearance is that every single, that the worker isn't being paid for any of their labor in any way. And under capitalism, the superficial appearance is that the worker is being compensated for every single hour of labor. That, in other words, there's, put that differently, under capitalism, the superficial appearance is that during every hour of labor, you're working for yourself. Under slavery, the superficial appearance is that there are 0 hours of labor where you're working for yourself. 100% of the hours of labor you're working for the slave owner. Under feudalism, it's right there out in the open, right? The corvée, right? The feudal labor obligation was set up such that, it was just laid down legally that the serf had to spend such and such many weeks a year or whatever doing corvée labor for the lord of the manor, and then he could spend the rest of the year, farming his own little plot in his own little plot of land that he had within that larger feudal estate. So the separation between the necessary labor and the surplus labor is right there out in the open under feudalism, whereas under slave and capitalist systems, it's disguised in opposite ways. Under the slave system, it seems like all of your labor is labor for your master, but of course that's not quite right, because after all, the resources that your master is using to feed and clothe you and all of that necessarily come from your own labor. Where else could they possibly come from? And under capitalism, well, you spend part of your day creating, goods or services that are sold and become the equivalent of the wages that you're paid, and you spend part of your day, working to generate the capitalist profits. If that weren't true, right? If 100% of your day was spent generating your own wages, then what on earth would be the advantage to the capitalist to employ you? They wouldn't, right? And so when you get to up to chapter 10 of Capital on the working day, which is this whole sort of grotesque Victorian horror novel, basically, about people being forced to work, 14, 16, 18-hour days, and, little kids, and, all this stuff. Marx starts out with these illustrations of different possible working days. And of course, in practice, it's all intermingled. It's not like there's a bell that rings at some point during the workday saying, okay, now you're done working to reproduce your own wages. It's time to start working to produce the capitalist profits. But you can, like, the effect is that we can, you do a certain amount of work, you generate a certain amount of money, right? Hence MCM prime, for your capitalist over the course of that day. Some of that goes into reproducing your own wages, and some of it goes into capitalist profits. And so, in this example, right, Marx says, okay, let's say the number of hours between A and B is how many hours you have to work in order to reproduce your own wages. And so then, from B to C is however many extra hours you're working beyond that to enrich the capitalist. And of course, working day one, if you're listening to this later on the podcast, you can't see this, but working day one, there's a very short line between B and C. Working day two, there's a longer one. Working day three, there's an even longer one. And the idea is that, well, assuming that we're holding constant how many hours you have to work in order to reproduce your own wages, which we're assuming, we're assuming that your labor power is being sold at its full value, right? So nobody's being ripped off. There's no violation of the law of exchange here. So we're assuming that those hours between A and B reproduce wages that are equivalent to the full value of your labor. In other words, that are equivalent to the package of commodities that you need to reproduce yourself at whatever level of subsistence. Then the only way to increase the capitalist profits is to increase the length of the working day. And in this, it's kind of appropriate, since we are here, right smack in the middle of spooky season, recording this on October 16th, that this is the chapter where Marx starts to use a lot of supernatural horror analogies. He talks about the capitalist vampire-like thirst for extracting more surplus, and the capitalist werewolf-like hunger, for more surplus, which leads to these extensions to the working day. So this is all in part 3 of Capital, but then in part 4, right, he talks about a different way that surplus can be extracted. For example, which might become more important if, for maybe like the regulatory state has stepped in and passed laws limiting the maximum length of the working day, which is, okay, instead of producing absolute surplus value, in other words, you're producing more surplus, right? You're devoting more of your day you're devoting more of your day to producing the capitalist profits as opposed to the amount that you have to spend on your own wages. Says, well, there's also relative surplus value production. What is relative surplus value production? Well, if you get to the beginning of chapter 12, you get this little graphic here, right, which looks just like one of our working day graphics from the beginning of chapter 10. And he says, okay, what if we can't extend the distance? Remember, A to B is the segment that's you're working to reproduce your own wages, which we're assuming represent the full value of your labor power. B to C represents the hours that you're working to produce capitalist profits. So on the first model, the chapter 10 model, right, that we're assuming that the way that we're increasing the B to C segment is by increasing the overall distance from A to B. But then, that might not be enough to produce enough profits to outcompete, the capitalist competitors, or it might not, or it could be that strategy just isn't of like just adding more hours to the end of the working day just isn't available anymore because a bunch of annoying commies got some legislation passed to limit the length of the working day, for example, in some country. Not that that's exactly what happened in the 19th century Britain, but you get the idea. So then the only way to increase the length of the B to C segment is to move back from B to B prime here. In other words, again, if you're not looking at this, what's going on here is that the overall distance from A to C has stayed the same, but the relative share of it that's taken up by B to C has increased. And Marx says, wait a second, how could that possibly be consistent with our foundational assumption that that all commodities, including labor power, are being sold at their value? And says, well, what we need to do is we need to revolutionize the labor process in some way in order for it to take fewer hours to reproduce wages that sustain labor power at its full value. And so that's where you get all the chapters about about sort of large scale cooperation and different forms of innovation, division of labor, and eventually modern industrial technology, right? So chapter 15 is basically Marx's chapter about automation, which makes it super interesting to read in the age of AI. But again, rabbit hole we don't need to get off on right now. And the point is just this. Let's kind of think about everything that we just went over. First of all, what does Marx mean by exploitation? Well, it's certainly not that people are being ripped off in the sense of unequal exchange. He's actually at pains to say that we don't need to assume that in order to get exploitation. What he means by exploitation is the systematic extraction, right? The involuntary extraction of surplus labor from the immediate producers. So whenever Marx talks about exploitation and capital, he's always very keen to play up the analogy between capitalist exploitation and, for example, feudal exploitation. That's like the main metaphor he goes to over and over again. That, under feudalism, it's just obvious on the face of it that exploitation is going on. In other words, that there's this systematic, forcible extraction of surplus labor from the immediate producers. And his big claim is that under capitalism, the same thing happens, but in a different way, because of what he calls the mute compulsion, right, of economic circumstances. That, in other words, once you've got a certain set of property relations in place, then the worker, somebody born into the working class, has no realistic, a few people can get on the upward mobility lifeboats, but everybody else has no realistic option except to accept capitalist labor processes. So you're not being, noisily compelled the way you are under feudalism or slavery, these sort of pre-capitalist systems of direct extraction of surplus, but you are nevertheless being forced by your overall set of circumstances to submit to this systematic extraction of surplus labor. Right? So what Marx is laying out here, right? What he's arguing is that capitalism is like feudalism in these earlier systems in the sense that it's a system of structural extraction of surplus labor from a class of dominated producers, right? That's what he's very concerned to show, sort of against the first group, right, on that first front of the two-front ideological war, that capitalism is indeed, like feudalism, a system of, like systematic, forcible extraction of surplus labor from a class of dominated producers. But also, of course, Marx is very interested in capital and exploring what's different about capitalism, which, again, going back to the analogy about the silicon-based aliens, is that this is the first class society to have been made out of markets. So that's where you get that Victorian horror story about the length of the working day in chapter 10, for example, that because capitalism is made out of markets in ways that these earlier systems are not, right? That the dominating class, right, is unlike the dominating classes of previous systems. That under feudalism, for example, the corvée labor was just about extracting enough to keep the aristocrats and their families and retainers and whatever courts living in luxury, but that was the goal. Whereas under capitalism, the exploiters are engaged in market competition with each other, which means that they get this vampire-like thirst, this werewolf-like hunger, all this nice Gothic horror analogies in chapter 10. And the big thing I want you to notice about all of this is that in explaining the basic mechanics of Marx's theory of capitalist exploitation, that you have a set of property relations that gets you this labor force of doubly free producers who have no realistic choice except to sell their labor power to capitalists, and thus accept this arrangement where, much like feudal serfs, they have to spend part of their day doing necessary labor, but then another part doing surplus labor to enrich the ruling class. Absolutely nothing about that explanation included the word value, right? Now, I'm an agnostic about the value theory from chapter 1. As I've mentioned, there are people like Anwar Sheikh who sort of run sophisticated defenses of it that have convinced a lot of people whose opinions I respect. Shout out Cale Brooks here. Shout out Lilian Sakarichia here. But it's a complicated technical argument. I don't feel any particular need to have a dog in that fight. But what I want to point out is that if you read Capital carefully, Marx's theory of value and his theory of exploitation are related, right? I mean, I think Cohen overstates the case on this and saying, in making it sound like there's just no interest in relationship there at all. They are related, but they're not related in the way a lot of people think they are. The way that they're related has to do with the second front in that two-front ideological war, right? That the way that they're related is that it's very important to Marx to show that workers are being exploited, even if every commodity, including labor power, is sold at its full value, right? And so, yeah, you need a theory of what counts as the full value in order to make that claim go through. So that, the sort of basic claim that capitalism, like feudalism, like these other systems, is a system of structural extraction of surplus labor from a class of dominated producers, right? That basic claim about exploitation, that you don't need the theory of value for, right? That does not stand or fall with the value theory of chapter 1. That's logically independent of it. What isn't logically independent of it is the claim that this is all totally consistent with the law of exchange, because at least the form of that claim you get in Capital, because of course that is all framed in terms of the theory of value. So then a really interesting question is, okay, well, let's say for the sake of argument that you think the theory of value is wrong, like plenty of academically trained economists who are otherwise politically sympathetic to Marxism do end up coming to that conclusion. Shout out Mike Beggs. Read his old Jacobin article, Zombie Marx, if you want a sense of that. How that kind of argument goes, right? So if you're one of those people who's like otherwise sympathetic to Marxism, but you don't buy the theory of value, or even if you're not sure what to think about the theory of value, which I think is a really reasonable place to be at. Because again, once you understand what that theory consists of, right, what Marx is claiming, it's really not something that's just sort of intuitively obvious. This is a complicated technical claim. Whether or not it's true is a complicated technical question. And so if you're not sure whether it's true, right, if you're even worried about whether the theory of value is true, then I think you should be interested in this question of, okay, is it logically detachable from the theory of exploitation? And my answer is, yeah, it is logically detachable from the theory of exploitation. But there is this really interesting and important secondary claim that Marx wants to use it to make, that it's not cleanly detachable from. In other words, certainly Marx's argument on that second point, right? The second point being that we can make all this, go through even on this, generous assumption about value, that the law of exchange is not being violated, all that stuff. That much, at least in the form that Marx gives it, does depend on the theory of value. So the new question, the interesting question is, okay, well, can we, if we're even worried, even if we're not sure, if we're even worried about whether the chapter 1 theory of value goes through, can we reconstruct that claim? And the answer is maybe, right? I mean, it's an interesting question to think about. And if you want to think about it more with me, you can sign up for the class that I'm teaching on this right now. It has already started, but we're going very slowly. This is like the 4th time I've taught a volume 1 class. I'm also doing a volume 2 class at the same time this time. But the previous 3 times I've taught volume 1, or 2 previous times I've gone through the whole thing with students. The 3rd is the in-person class in LA, which, by the way, is still ongoing. We're going to read chapters 18 and 19 for next Wednesday. So for anyone who wants to join, if you're in the Los Angeles area, we meet at Cafe Mock in Koreatown at 7 p.m. on Wednesday nights. And we've had to miss some meetings lately because of my travel schedule, but we are meeting again this Wednesday and the next Wednesday, and then we're gonna have to miss a couple more because of travel, unfortunately. But yeah, there's like all 3 of the previous times that I've taught Capital, including the ongoing free in-person one in LA. We've gone through it, kind of at a gallop, right? Like a chapter a week, except for the very longest chapters that we've broken up. So I thought it'd be really interesting to do it way slower. So on Patreon, started teaching this volume 1 class that meets on Saturdays at 1 p.m. Eastern time, 10 a.m. here on the West Coast on Saturdays. And we're only doing a maximum of 1 section of 1 chapter at a time. So class has been going on for several weeks. There are a few weeks we had to miss because of travel stuff. But we've just gone through the 4 sections of chapter 1. So we're about to read chapter 2 for Saturday. So if you do want to join late, it's very easy to catch up at this point. You just have to, the only thing you need to catch up on is chapter 1, and all the old lectures are available forever for everybody who signed up to the class. But on that note, I think that is about all I have to say for today. And I'm going to be back tomorrow at the same bat time, same bat channel. So we're gonna keep up this what we started doing the last few weeks. These morning episodes at 11 a.m. 11 a.m. Eastern time, or sorry, not 11 a.m. 11:30 a.m. Eastern time, 8:30 a.m. on the West Coast. So tomorrow we are doing one on Donald Trump's foreign policy and a slightly psychotic claim that he made in a recent speech, that the only reason the U.S. lost the wars in Vietnam and Afghanistan because we were too woke about how we fought those wars. So that episode is going to be tomorrow. Again, 11:30 a.m. East Coast, 8:30 a.m. here on the West Coast. I will see everybody then. Left is best.